Did Admiral Bradley order that second strike because there were still survivors after the initial strike?
Again, as I read for you, Admiral Bradley worked well within his authority and the law. He directed the engagement to ensure the boat was destroyed and the threat of narco-terrorists to the United States was completely eliminated.
So was the initial order from Secretary Hegseth, everyone be killed, and did that come from President Trump?
I saw that quoted in a Washington Post story. I would reject that the Secretary of War ever said that. However, the president has made it quite clear that if narco-terrorists, again, are trafficking illegal drugs towards the United States, he has the authority to kill them.
It's Ken Harbaugh with the MeidasTouch Network. What you hear is the sound of the wheels coming off. This story from the Trump administration that these strikes on supposed drug-running speedboats from Venezuela were totally legit, it's not going to hold water for much longer. You can already hear the setup. Hegseth denying he ever gave an order to double tap survivors. The admiral in charge being called to the mat. Someone is going to take the fall here. And I promise you, the Trump regime will gladly place that burden on anyone wearing a uniform if it means they can once again dodge responsibility. As of now, the Trump administration won't even come clean on the basic facts of the strike and whether there were, in fact, survivors after the initial hit.
Why won't the administration either confirm or deny or reveal whether or not there were survivors after that initial first strike? And what imminent threat would two survivors pose who were clinging presumably to the wreckage of that boat?
Again, as I said, I think you guys are sort of not listening fully to the statement I provided. Admiral Bradley worked well within his authority and the law, directing the engagement to ensure the boat was totally destroyed and the threat to the narco-terrorists, to the United States, was eliminated. And for any further questions about his thinking, I would defer you to the Department of War. I obviously wasn't in the room for these.
Just to follow.
The whole premise of these attacks, protecting Americans from drug traffickers, is beginning to look shaky. Donald Trump just pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was convicted by a U.S. jury of trafficking a massive amount of drugs into this country.
The president several days ago said it was his intention to pardon the former president of Honduras, who was a convicted drug trafficker. And yesterday on Air Force One, the president said that if someone sells drugs in that country, that doesn't mean you'll arrest the president and put him in jail for the rest of his life. How is that different than what the administration is accusing Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro of?
There is one thing we can be sure of in this whole disgraceful saga. More details are coming. A congressional investigation is imminent. There are good reporters with great sources inside the Pentagon, and the Trump regime cannot be taken at its word. Yesterday, I talked to Jake Sullivan and John Feiner, who were key players in the previous administration's national security team. We covered the obvious illegality of any order to double tap shipwrecked survivors. In part 2, Jake, John, and I discussed the responsibility the military has to refuse unlawful orders and just how undisciplined and careless the Trump administration is when it comes to its war-making decisions. John, there's a lot of debate in my world about how somebody in one of these positions should conduct themselves if they receive a dubious order, especially since their JAG has now been fired, right? And those are the lawyers you're referring to that Hegseth cleared out of the Pentagon, the ones who would have told those combatant commanders that what they were contemplating was illegal. And people are of two minds here. There's what I'm going to call the Halsey camp, which says you resign before you get that order. And we've spent a lot of time talking about or speculating about the resignation of Admiral Halsey, who left the leadership position down in SOCOM, the combat command that has been charged with blowing these boats out of the water. He departed. And I think we have some indication now of why. And then there are others who say you have to stay to mitigate the worst impulses of this administration, because you can only fall on your sword once, and once you do, you're useless, you're spent. I suspect this came up rarely in the Biden administration, but it is a daily dilemma now, especially for those on the front lines. What would you do?
Yeah, look, these are really hard, really personal decisions for everybody involved. They're matters of conscience. They're matters of kind of calculation about your own legal exposure and future. And so it's hard to kind of put yourself into the position of somebody who is put in really, I think, an impossible task of getting an order that is quite clear, at least in terms of what it is asking you to do, and having to, at the same time as you're trying to operate effectively and accurately, also conduct this separate analysis of whether you're doing the right thing, morally and legally. That is a nightmare scenario to put any sort of operator in. And there's actually a very interesting essay I read about this by a guy named David French, who is a former JAG lawyer, right of center political thinker, but talked about how there are two different kinds of orders in this context. One is kind of the broader policy decision to wage this kind of conflict. And that, he sort of argues, is above the level that the average operator in the field should be questioning one way or the other, because there's so many factors that go into that are kind of above their pay grade. But then there's the very specific question that was raised by this Hegseth order of, in this particular circumstance, do you take these people out who are clearly incapacitated, no longer posing a threat? And that is the kind of order that any operator should be able to make an assessment of and determine that it is just not proper, not legal. So if I were put in that second situation, I would like to believe that I would not execute that order. The first situation, I will acknowledge, is just a much harder call, although I have real questions about whether this entire endeavor falls within in the ambit of the law either.
Well, and where it's all going, for that matter. Where are these strikes leading us? And they're now talking about shutting down Venezuelan airspace. And
Jake, I got a question about that. Can you shut down the airspace of another country with a tweet?
Well, my guess is that commercial airliners, any CEO of one of those companies is going to call its pilots and say, "Hey, maybe don't fly."
Yeah.
But on a more serious note, this is a blockade. So this is an active war. And the question is, on what basis, for what purpose, with what authority? And we don't have good answers to any of those questions.
Can you talk about the importance of process? Because you were part of maybe I wouldn't say well-oiled machine, but certainly an apparatus that had policies and procedures and processes, and they protected you. As often as they slowed you down, those processes protected you. It seems like this White House operates without any process whatsoever, so that the president, over a Truth Social post, can shut down the airspace of a sovereign country. That was the bad joke I just made. Yeah. And I'd love for your perspective on the balance between the speed of action and the freedom of action that allows an administration, which is great for most military commanders, but how that gets you in trouble as a country, how that is what leads to stupid wars.
Well, look, if you don't actually take the time to get your principals around the table, your Secretary of Defense, Chairman, Secretary of State, your senior leaders of your intelligence community, with the president, the vice president, the national security advisor, the principal deputy, others, and say, what are we trying to accomplish, with what means, over what time frame, and how are we going to measure success? If you're not actually walking through those questions in a serious way, then you can find yourself stumbling into a situation where, you just start bombing Venezuela for any reason or no reason at all. And I do worry that we are creeping up to that line right now in a big way. They've been focused on taking these boats out, which, as John said, is legally dubious, to say the least, and is not clear, what that's accomplishing for us. But the idea that we could end up in a full-on war in Venezuela without any real sense of a policy process that puts guardrails around that tries to define the risks around that, or that then explains to the American people what the heck that's all about. This, I think, is a potential recipe for disaster. I'd also say the lack of process is popping up in other places that are very concerning, like what's happening in the Ukraine negotiations. The fact that you've got free radicals bouncing off every surface, Witkoff calling the Russians, Rubio and Vance seem to be at odds with one another. This is not, in my view, conducive to actually generating an outcome in the Ukraine war that's good for Ukraine or good for the United States of America. And so we're seeing this lack of process play out in the Venezuela context, but in other critical contexts as well.
Fresh start, same system. And in that system, the banks win and you pay month after month while the fees, the interest, the collection calls all keep piling up unless you fight back. PDS Debt has already helped hundreds of thousands of people cut their debt and put money back where it belongs, in their pockets, not the banks. Whether you're drowning in credit cards, struggling with personal loans, or trying to get out from under medical bills, PDS Debt has real options to help. They don't just crunch the numbers, they actually look at your situation and build a personalized plan designed around your needs. And there's no minimum credit score required. Their entire job is to help you save more, pay off your debt faster, and finally keep more of your own money. And look, this isn't guesswork. PDS Debt is A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau. They've earned thousands of 5-star reviews on Google, and they hold a 5-star rating on Trustpilot. That kind of trust doesn't happen by accident. It's because they've helped hundreds of thousands of Americans break free from debt. But here's the truth. Every month you wait costs you more. More interest, more fees, more stress. The best day to start was yesterday. The second best is right now. If I needed this, it's exactly the service I'd use. Don't wait another month. Take back control in 30 seconds. Get your free personalized assessment and the best option for you at pdsdebt.com/Ken. That's pdsdebt.com/Ken. pdsdebt.com/Ken.
Hey everyone, quick break to tee up a trailer for a new show that I have been dying to tell you about. Chris Goldsmith, audience favorite here, is launching his own podcast. Enjoy.
This is On Offense, and I'm Chris Goldsmith, combat vet, anti-fascist investigator, and founder of Task Force Butler and Veterans Fighting Fascism. I've spent years infiltrating extremist movements, exposing fascist street gangs, and organizing other veterans to stand up for democracy. And now, we're living in a reality where those same far-right maniacs are getting embedded throughout our federal government. That's why I'm bringing my work here. Raw, direct, unfiltered. Every week on Offense, I'll break down what's happening behind the closed doors of hate groups, how extremist groups are getting closer to real political power, and what it's going to take to stop the next wave of political violence. You'll hear from organizers on the front lines and from veterans who know what real service to country looks like. On Offense is for anyone who's ready to fight for democracy. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to watch our videos, make sure you're following Valor Media Network on YouTube. America's in a fight for its future. Let's go on offense.
John, so much of the freedom of action that I referenced, that the military is granted and that the executive is afforded in those Article 1 powers, is, at least in our modern system, built on a presumption of good faith by the American people, and this idea that they trust the administration, even when it's being secret, to act in the best interests of the American people, which obviously there are a ton of problems with that. We've had administrations that have betrayed that trust in the past, but it feels like we're in a new era where that presumption itself is gone. And the first reaction I have, and that most people in my position now have, is not to trust. It's the opposite of trust but verify. Our impulse is we don't believe what this administration is saying or doing. And I don't know what the question is here, but I imagine that breach of trust is going to have effects for generations, certainly for the next president and the president after that. That has got to be a really hard thing to reconstruct.
Absolutely. And, I can give you a good concrete example, I think, of how that can pose a challenge to administration, because it's not just a situation like the one we're in now that makes challenging, where people may start to question whether their government is doing the right thing, which I think is right and proper. It's also in what I would call a much more real situation of crisis, because it's not really clear that the United States is under threat, either from Venezuela or from these, random one-off drug boats. But there are real threats that the country faces. And in our administration, we found ourselves in the very strange and somewhat unusual situation of getting intelligence, one morning when we walked in to read the president's daily brief, that said, at some point in the future, maybe in a few months, Russia is going to invade and try to essentially conquer all of Ukraine. And we then, had to decide what to do about that. But one of the things that we decided to do was inform people, inform the public, inform our allies that this was coming so that we could be prepared. So we could be prepared to impose sanctions on Russia, so we could surge arms to Ukraine so they'd be able to defend their country. And one of the things that we ran up against kind of headlong in the early stages of that effort is people looking back on, for example, the previous administration, the Bush administration's attempts to sell the United States and the world on the invasion of Iraq and saying, well, U.S. intelligence is sometimes wrong. Administrations sometimes mislead. And we had a much higher hurdle to get over to convince people that this was coming because of past conduct of prior administrations. And I have to say, given what the Trump administration is doing now, both the Trump administration going forward and any future administration is going to have an even higher hurdle on convincing the world about a genuine threat. God forbid, should one come, which it will, because that's what the world tends to throw up.
Jake, talk about that PDB, that presidential daily briefing. And this is your chance to pitch the new pod, because I love the framing, trying to bring the audience inside the Oval Office as you're briefing the president. I would imagine every morning when you were in the job. Who knows how often it's happening nowadays. But what is the PDB? Why is it important? And what do you think is happening with it now?
So the PDB is, as you said, the president's daily brief. And what happens is the National Security Advisor, the principal deputy, the Homeland Security Advisor, the president, the vice president's national security advisor, and then senior leaders from the intelligence community gather in the Oval Office. Usually it's the first thing of the day. And the intelligence leaders bring a book, and the book tends to have 3 pieces in it that have been pulled together by the intelligence community, either on something that's happening, that day or that hour, an imminent crisis, or on a longer term trend or issue that they want to bring to the attention of the president. And they brief those issues. And then we have a discussion about whether we're properly postured to deal with the threat or seize an opportunity, what policy implications come out of that. And that usually goes on for 30 to 45 minutes. And so John and I thought when we left government that the coolest thing in the world to do was podcast, something you can probably attest to. And we thought we'd start a podcast, which we called The Long Game, which basically tries to follow that format that takes 2 or 3 issues, digs into them, steps back and says, what are the larger implications here? What are the impacts on policy? What are the crises? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? And then tries to explain to listeners, this is what a president is having to contend with. These are the things going through his mind. This is what he's being told. This is how it works. And really trying to bring listeners behind the scenes of what's happening with these policy issues. The one we've just been talking about, for example, both how is the Trump administration handling it? And if you had a different administration sitting there, how would we be going through discussions about potential military action in Venezuela, the risks and benefits? And John and I ran a tabletop exercise a couple of episodes ago on the risks of actually going to war in Venezuela. So that's the idea behind the podcast. We hope people will give it a listen. As for what the current administration is doing with the PDB, God only knows. But I'm skeptical that it is a particularly rigorous or systematic inquiry. And it probably does not involve a lot of the president actually reading the briefing.
Well, John, I'd like you to put your reporter hat back on and imagine how the PDB is going these days. Because by all accounts, Donald Trump is spending more time designing his ballroom than he is paying attention to the PDB or thinking about how to keep Americans safe.
Yeah, look, I mean, with the caveat that one of the things the administration currently is not doing is consulting people like Jake and me. What you can tell from afar, and by the way, it goes to your question earlier about process, is having these briefings, having these meetings with the president actually protects him too. Having a process in which people are able to raise issues like what could go wrong if we follow this course of action, what sorts of legal issues might be surfaced. Even if ultimately you decide to proceed, even if you ultimately decide to take the risks, at least doing so eyes open and giving everybody a chance who might later come out and say, I wasn't consulted or I had an objection that wasn't listened to. Giving them an opportunity to be heard, I think, is quite important, both in getting the right answer, which is the most important reason to do it, but also just in the cover your ass sense for the president, for the senior team. Because one of the things that I suspect is going to happen in the aftermath of all of this is there will be all kinds of people who come forward and say, well, I knew this was wrong or thought this was wrong and nobody ever asked me and I'm an expert. And process protects you from that sort of criticism, in addition to at least knowing what you're getting into, even if you ultimately decide to do something risky or wrongheaded.
Yeah. Jake, where can people find the podcast? Where can people find you guys? Not physically. We
yeah, right. Exactly.
Undisclosed
locations. That's right. So the podcast you can find wherever you get your podcasts. It's called The Long Game with Jake Sullivan and John Feiner. We call it The Long Game because we're not just trying to deal with hot takes of the issues of the day, but the way that we've just had this conversation. What's the bigger picture here? What is, in fact, the long game? So we would love to have people give it a listen. And, we're learning as we go, and we're watching you because you're giving us a good example of dealing with these hard issues in a compelling way that reaches a big audience. So we're putting on our best impression, our best Harbaugh impression.
Thanks, Jake. Thanks, John. We'll put all the links in the show notes. Let's have you back on soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great to see you. Thanks.
Love this video? Support independent media and unlock exclusive content, ad-free videos, and custom emojis by becoming a paid member of our YouTube channel today. You can also gift memberships to others. Let's keep growing together.